Welcome to another program in the CSEC Circle. Today we are going to be looking at Langston Hughes' poem, Theme for English B. I am Sam Sawyer. To my immediate right is Charlene Fabrice and further across Winnell Yearwood. Langston Hughes was a black American writer. He lived from 1920 to 1967. He wrote many different kinds of literature, among them short stories, essays, plays, and lots of poetry. As you know, many things can influence what authors create. And sometimes it's helpful if we know something about other works a writer has written whose creations we are studying. It helps to give us a better sense of where a particular work might fit into his overall oeuvre or body of works, as well as his thinking, his concerns as a writer. So we are going to begin today by sharing with you 4 other poems written by Langston Hughes. What they have in common is a focus on relations between black people and white people in the United States of America. Charlene is going to read the first poem for you.
I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America.
That poem was written by Langston Hughes in response to another poem by a famous white American poet whose name was Walt Whitman. Whitman's poem was entitled, I Hear America Singing. When Hughes and other black people looked at Whitman's I Hear America Singing, they realized that this song that Whitman composed that was supposed to represent America did not include them. That is why Hughes entitled his poem, I Too Am America. Now I'm going to read for you 2 other pieces by Hughes that will give you a sense, a broader sense, a richer sense of how he saw race relations between blacks and whites in America. The first one is called Refugee in America, and clearly the title speaks for itself. There are words like freedom, sweet and wonderful to say. On my heartstrings freedom sings all day, every day. There are words like liberty that almost make me cry. If you had known what I knew, you would know why. The second poem I'm going to read for you paints a slightly different picture of this relationship between black and white. It's called Subway Rush Hour. Mingled breath and smell so close, mingled black and white so near, no room for fear. And finally, Winnell is going to share a poem by Hughes entitled Harlem.
What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode?
Now, in addition to those 4 poems, which give you some sense of Hughes' thinking and feeling about race relations in America, I want you to consider the work of which Theme for English B was a part. This was a collection entitled Montage of a Dream Deferred. Now, 3 key words are part of that title. Montage means that somebody has put together a whole thing by combining parts, which may be pieces of music, which may be text from different writing, or which may be images. So Hughes, as it were, signals to us that he's drawing from his African-American culture, from jazz, from blues music, from Negro spirituals, and so on, and using these influences to produce a poem that's like a set of broken pieces, but when put together, make a whole picture. And Theme for English B actually comes from that collection. Now, secondly, there's the word dream. And that word there doesn't mean something that goes through your mind when you're sleeping and not particularly conscious. It actually refers to what Stephen Henderson, a former professor of African American studies at Howard University, called the great theme of African American literature and black life in the United States, namely freedom. So the dream referred to in Montage of a Dream Deferred, and the poem that Winnell just read, What Happens to a Dream Deferred, is the black person's dream of freedom in America. Now, black people have been in America for hundreds of years, but for much of that time, they've been enslaved by white people. And a time came when the government legislated that all people should be free. But although there was a change in the law and black people were free nominally, the actuality is that for many of them, they still did not feel like they enjoyed any freedom, any equality, or any justice in the United States. That is why the last word, deferred, is in the title. Montage of a Dream Deferred says, you promised us freedom, you promised us justice, you promised us equality, but it's been postponed. We haven't seen it yet. We're still not enjoying it. So it's against that backdrop that we want you to study and to consider Langston Hughes' theme for English B. Now, let's ask one of the panelists to engage with the title of this poem.
Okay, the title. Theme for English B basically refers to a piece of writing for composition for college freshmen. So the persona basically says he was supposed to write a paper. Theme here just means composition for English B. As a freshman, he would have just entered college, and there it is, he's faced with his first assignment. So the theme for English B here, the title of the poem, just tells us how he's going to, what is it that he's supposed to do, and then he goes on in the rest of the poem to tell us how he goes about attempting to write that composition or that paper that was required of him.
As we can see when we consider the poem, the first verse reads this way. The instructor said, go home and write a page tonight, and let that page come out of you, then it will be true. So from the very beginning, we see Hughes establishes in this poem a connection between how you see yourself, the truth of your experiences, and the act of writing. Now, Winnell is going to share with us a very interesting quotation from Langston Hughes about his own father in terms of how Hughes' father would have seen himself as a black man in America, along with other black people. Winnell?
Interestingly enough, Hughes's father actually did not like other Negroes. In fact, Hughes wrote, my father hated Negroes. I think he hated himself too for being a Negro. He disliked all his family because they were Negroes.
So, as you can see, this business of producing a piece of writing out of one's life can be a very stressful, challenging, demanding, even problematic experience. Perhaps as a student you can identify with that. Perhaps in the past you've been asked to produce a piece of writing based on your life and you had challenges meeting that assignment, although one might think they should be easy because after all, you're the world's greatest expert on your own life. When we consider poetry, as we would have said in other programs, we know that typical of human thinking, we try to make sense of poems, as we do of other things, by categorizing them. So by classification, theme for English B would be put into a very big category called open form poetry. This means that unlike poems where you have rhyme, rhythm, a particular meter, a fixed pattern by which the poem is organized, there's a lot more freedom. So that, in a sense, the number of types of open form poetry is unlimited. However, with theme for English B, we can be more specific because of the way the poem seems to come across to us as readers. And the term that some scholars use for this is interior monologue. Winnell, I think you're going to talk to us a little more about interior monologue in terms of theme for English B.
In terms of theme for English B, the interior monologue is a reflection of the fact that the persona, who was a 22-year-old college student, is having a conversation with himself as he's struggling to cope with how am I going to deal with this assignment that I've been given by my white instructor. And so within the interior monologue, he is talking about the instructions, and he's also reflecting his own thoughts. That is essentially what the interior monologue does here.
Thank you, Winnell. Now, when you look at the poem on the page, you will notice that after the opening line, the instructor said, the next 4 lines are indented and they're italicized. Now remember, poetry is a crafted, creative thing, so we mustn't take these formatting features for granted. What do you see this formatting as pointing to?
Okay, clearly the professor seemed to have been a more experienced writer. It's very well structured. The way he says, go home and write a page tonight and let it come out of you, then it will be true. There is rhyme and stuff like that in it. So it sets itself clearly. It seems to be set apart very clearly from the rest of the poem, which is spoken by the main persona in the paper. Sorry, the main persona of the poem, who is the young black man that Winnell mentioned. So it seems to stand out from the rest of the poem in terms of its structure.
And would you agree that normally we think that the ability to write poetry that rhymes is a skill that not everybody has, and that the fact that this is written in couplets, as you say, every 2 lines rhyme, would suggest, as you said, that the instructor is experienced, as we would expect the teacher to be, right? And then we come to the first line of the next verse. And perhaps we can appreciate the significance of these italicized lines more when we read that first line. The persona says, or asks of himself, and maybe of us, the readers, I wonder if it's that simple. Talk to us about this verse.
Well, when we look at this second verse, it is clear that this young man is uncertain what he is going to write. And so he chooses to give us a whole lot of background information as opposed to tackling the particular instruction given by his tutor. So he tells us where he lives, he tells us where his college is, and he gives us a whole complex instruction about how to get to the why. And students, I don't know if you know what a why is, but he's referring to the Young Men's Christian Association. And usually what they have are, we can call them cheap facilities for persons who may not necessarily have the money to pay for proper accommodation, or for accommodation, I should say. And so this is essentially where he is going. So in that first stanza, he's saying, who am I? What am I going to say?
Now, again, as students who often have to do writing as part of your education, you'd recognize that sometimes finding something relevant to say can be a struggle. And one of the strategies that writing experts sometimes recommend is that you just write whatever comes to mind, because often the act of physically writing will prompt you to come up with something that is meaningful in terms of the assignment you've been given. So as Vanilla has pointed out, this persona, this young man who's 22 years old and going to college and given this assignment, begins by writing about the most obvious things, biographical details. Now, there's a name for this, and we would have mentioned it in other programs where we get a lot of details piling up. Remember, the name for this is catalog. It's a list. It's like when you're going to the supermarket or you have to go to town and there are a lot of things you need to buy, places you need to go, and you are confident, I'm not going to remember them all. I'm going to go back home and I've forgotten something. So what you do is you write a list. But in poetry, we call it a catalog. So this verse is basically a catalog of biographical details showing that the young man is struggling with coming up with something to say, but he's got some words down on the paper. All right. Then, in a clearly structured poem, there's a change to a new verse with a different kind of focus. Charlene, talk to us about that verse.
Part of the instruction that was given to the young man is the last line of what the professor says, then it will be true. So he's concerned about writing something that is true. So he begins the next stanza. It is not easy to know what is true for you or me at 22, which is my age.
Now, before Charlene goes any further, again, students, I'm sure you could identify with this, because this says something about a lot of people. I don't know if it's exclusive to black culture or not, but even though we all live 24 hours every day, for most of which we are conscious we are not asleep, most of us tend not to think about ourselves very deeply. It's almost as though we're on autopilot. So here's this young man at 22 asked to write about himself on which he should be an authority, and he confesses it's not easy to know what is true for you or me at 22. And notice the part where he says, for you or me. So he's claiming that it's not just an individual challenge for him, but it's a common human challenge. Can you identify with this? Charlene, please continue.
And interestingly, he ends the stanza with, me? Who? So he's still uncertain. Even after he goes through some detail, he tries to, in that stanza, to identify with his neighborhood. He mentions Harlem. He says, Harlem, I hear you. You know, I guess I am what I feel and see and hear. When he says, I guess, it's like, maybe, but I'm not too sure. Because somebody says, who are you? And you say, well, I guess I am this person. So he's asking himself a lot of questions in that stanza. Like I said, he begins with the whole notion of it's not easy to find out who he is, and he ends with still not knowing, still being uncertain as to who he is. He says, I hear you, we too, you and me, I hear you in New York. I'm part of Harlem, which is a small part of New York. I'm part of the wider, state of New York, but still asking himself, who am I really? And if I have to be true, as the professor asked or demanded, then I have to first know who I am. And there seems to be that struggle, as we said, throughout the paper that is required to write, as to finding out, trying to ascertain who exactly he is, and how can his writing be true if he doesn't at first tell himself or know for certain who exactly is his true self.
Now, because you're students of literature, you know it's not enough to just talk about the subject matter of a literary work. After all, you're not a history student, you're not a sociologist, a psychologist, a philosopher. You're somebody who's looking at the craftsmanship of writing. So when you look at this verse, you will notice that there are at least three features of it, three elements of its style, which are related to the struggle and the uncertainty about who he is that this persona is verbalizing for us. And we're going to ask the panelists to talk about them. One of them is the sentence structure or the syntax, that's the order of words. A second one is repetition. And the third one is the use of questions.
So he does use questions, which we can call rhetorical questions. The sentence structure is not what we know of as, having a firm number of words in a sentence, that sort of thing. So it seems sometimes that he is all over the place, and it does seem to fit in with the subject matter in terms of, if I am questioning, if I am uncertain, then I won't be thinking in straight, structured sentences. He also uses, the dashes quite a bit. It's like, hear me, we too, you, me, talk on this page. So it's not what we know of as a straight sentence as, in English language, but there's those pauses and stuff like that give us, I think, a true picture of his thoughts, how his thought processes are actually working.
To some extent, what we're also seeing is a lot of repetition. And so he keeps repeating, I wonder, I am, I went, I feel and see and hear, I like. All of these things are suggesting that he is, to some extent, still searching. What exactly am I? The repetition of those things. To some extent, what is being suggested is that his environment is shaping him. He's a product of his environment. But at the same time, this world that is centered around me, what exactly is it saying about me? Or what exactly do I know about myself?
Now, we know that human beings are more than biographical information, where we were born, where we went to school, and where we live. Perhaps the things that distinguish us are our personal preferences, or likes, or tastes. And when we come to the next and final verse of the poem, and notice also the longest one, this is where the speaker, the persona, does seem to find something worthwhile to say in this essay, which the instructor assigned him and said should be the truth and should come out of him. Having, as it were, given us details that you could Google in a modern age like this, he's now giving us things that we would only know about if he shared them personally, either in a private conversation or in the age of the internet by putting them on Facebook. So this is really the most significant verse of the poem, the final one. Talk to us about how this verse unfolds.
He says very commonplace things. I like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. And we think of those things as things that every ordinary person would like. You know, he says I like what he likes for a Christmas present and things like that. He talks about his taste in music. And this is where I find it gets interesting in line 25 when he says, I guess being colored doesn't make me not like the same things other folks like who are other races. So remember we said from early that this poem, and as most of Langston Hughes' poems, talk quite a bit about race relations in America. At 22, when he looks at the things that he likes, the normal everyday things, he realizes, he stops and he says, again, I guess, those words which suggest not full certainty, but he says, but wait, I know other people who like the same things, and they are not black like me. So are we really different? Because if I, as a black person, like the same things that people who are other races like, then hey, to me, that speaks of some kind of equality between us.
Or a common humanity.
Yes.
Now, before we go any further in discussing this verse, you notice that in line 24, there are 3 B words, and I want you to comment on them. Bessie, Bop, and Ba. What is the significance of these 3 words?
Well, the first thing we note is that there are alliterative, Bessie, Bop, and Bach. But what we also note is that it's a reflection of this 22-year-old's very eclectic taste. Because when we're thinking about Bessie, we were thinking about jazz.
Bessie Smith.
Bessie Smith.
The black American singer.
Yes.
Legendary.
Yes. Bop, I'm assuming that he is referring to bebop.
And what is that exactly? A music style?
It's a kind of
style?
music that would have been very prevalent in the 80s, 60s, I think, perhaps.
Yeah.
And then there is Bach, which we know is clearly classical music. And so, to me, when he says these things, it suggests you can't put me in any box. I'm not this stereotype. Because we tend to put blacks in a box. We think that they only are into loud music, that there is no refinement. And so when we look at his taste, we can see that they're all over the place.
Cosmopolitan.
Yes.
Kind of universal.
Definitely.
Okay, Charlene, why don't you resume your commentary on that final verse?
Well, he says, the same things. After he says, I guess I like the same things that other people like, he said, so will my page be colored that I write? So at the end of the day, he's again asking, if I'm going to write a page, a paper, a composition, which is true of me, since I am black, then will my composition be black? And that brings me to the question, what is a black composition as opposed to a white composition? So it's a question of, again, who I am and what it is that must come out of me. And if this is true of me, then it has to reflect who I am. Although at this stage of the poem, we are still not exactly sure that he is sure who he is. Because he continues, being me, it will not be white. So although I'm not sure if my paper is going to be black, but I'm not too sure if it will be white, it can be white. I know that part, that much. So far, he is still grappling with, struggling, as we said, with what it is that he has to write in that paper.
And then the line that comes right after takes us into the heart of this poem, which really and truly is about the complexity of race relations in America. Because the persona says, but it will be a part of you, instructor. So for the first time since the opening lines, we see the persona actually finding some point of identification with this white college instructor who's assigned him this writing task. So let's look at that.
When we actually look at that, what is really clear is this. Literally, when we think of the United States, we think of all races, all classes, all intertwined, all mixed.
when we speak of black and white America, please understand that we don't want you to think that we mean that all black people think the same way about white people and that all white people think the same way about black people. Just remember Malcolm X.
Yes.
There was a time when he thought that all white people were devils, but before he was assassinated, he did change his thinking and say, you know, that there are actually some good white people. And of course that means there are also some bad black people.
Yes.
But we're just using this as broad categories to represent a kind of sense of what is out there in terms of black-white relations in America. Manel, please continue.
As you were saying, the thing is, when we look at the Statue of Liberty, it says, give me your poor. And this has been the view of everyone around the world who wants refuge. And this is why they gravitate to going to the United States. And so the understanding is that I am a part of you has to do with the fact that once you've landed there, that you become an American citizen. I mean, that was so for a long time until recently with Trump. But certainly when you landed there, when you got off that boat, you got off that plane, you hit American soil, you became an American. I'm a part of you.
The land of the free.
The land of the free.
We'll come back to this business of Trump and immigrants later in our discussion. But I think there's something else we would want to add as well, that based on the history of America, there's a very real sense, a concrete physical sense in which black people are part of white people. Because we know that just as in the Caribbean, in Barbados, for example, that there were sexual relations between white men and black women. And so a lot of people in America actually have within them a mixture of black blood and white blood.
Yes.
So they are part of each other in a very literal way in terms of their DNA.
But in this case, he is not necessarily talking about that. He says, that's American in line 33. So when he says, you are part of me and I'm part of you, he's identifying we are both American, even if we may be of different races. The fact that we share that common, you can call it identity, nationality, we're American. But then he quickly goes on to say, sometimes perhaps you don't want to be part of me, as I do not always want to be part of you either. So recognizing that there's always that underlying current, that underlying resentment between blacks and whites, that
tension.
We have to, yes, that tension, that we have to admit that if we share the same line space, we enjoy the same air, we breathe the same air, we have to interact. So we are part of each other. You are the professor, I am the student, but that still makes us part of the same college community. However, recognizing that there often are times when I don't really feel like I want to be part of you, and I know that you don't always feel like you want to be part of me either. So there's this honesty on his part about that.
But would you agree with me, and you might not, that the overwhelming sense of this part of the poem is the persona's consciousness that there seems to be a tension and antagonism between blacks and whites in America which cannot be erased, which doesn't go away, even when there's a recognition of commonality? That, as Maya Angelou says in one of her poems called Human Family, we are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike.
Yes, I believe that he is, in a very indirect way, talking about what we can see as ugliness.
And if I recall, Winell, you had another interesting quotation from Langston Hughes that speaks to this particular a reality of black American life and writing, yes?
Yes.
Share it with us.
Okay, so this is what he actually says. My poems are indelicate, but so is life. Every ugly poem I write is a protest against the ugliness it pictures. And so the picture that we're getting here in Theme for English B is one where you have a 22-year-old who is living in a world that is not necessarily as free as he would want it to be. And we're talking about certain human rights, like, the freedom to be educated well.
We had recent incidents represented in the media where people were shot accidentally or deliberately for being in the wrong place, meaning some white neighborhood at the wrong time.
Yes. And I mean things as simple as freedom to enjoy your successes. Because it's almost as though when you are successful, there is some kind of bullseye put on you.
Yeah, and that applies to, or applied past tense to Langston Hughes' life in a very real way.
Yes.
Because he became very popular in America. He was well known. He did lots of readings in public, published lots of literary works, as we said. But the time came when he was accused of being a communist, and his career experienced a reversal. In fact, even some black people, and writers among them, were opposed to Langston Hughes. They felt that perhaps he was a traitor to his race, that he was being too open, too honest in the way he depicted the multifaceted nature of African-American life, not just celebrating the things which would be considered worthy of applause, but being true to the totality of black experience.
Yeah.
I think what is coming through here is that in as much as this poem was written so many years ago, it's still very relevant today.
Definitely.
And I think that a lot of blacks are no longer willing to sweep things under the carpet. Things are coming very much now into the open.
So, in a sense, we might say that Langston Hughes was ahead of his time.
Yes.
That he spoke with an openness and a courage and an honesty that might not have been typical of other writers of his generation or even other people.
Yes.
The last few lines of this poem are what I would call particularly pregnant, meaningful and rich. As I learned from you, I guess you learned from me. Although you're older and white and somewhat more free. Let's talk about those lines.
The word somewhat in line 40, it's as if he doesn't want to tell the professor straight, look, you're free and I'm not. It's a recognition that, yes, you're older, you're white. Let's admit, let's just be honest. You're more free. So when you ask me to be true and to, express myself truly, I still feel a certain restriction because of my lack of total freedom as a young black man. And even today, we keep making reference to the fact that what Langston Hughes wrote about is still relevant. The young black man in America, is targeted so much more. His position is very precarious. So this person, the persona here, doesn't want to say, look, you're free, I'm not. You're white, I'm black. So let's be honest. He said, this is what you asked me to be honest. I learned from you as a student, you're the professor, but you learn from me as well in our everyday interaction. And because of your relative freedom, then what would come out of you that is true is not necessarily what is true for me. So at the end of the poem, he's asking earlier in the poem about, what's really true. We don't get a sense that the questions have been answered. However, there is some kind of conclusion, finality, when he says, you're somewhat more free, and that is what I have to say. This is my page. And he concludes, this is my composition. This is what I have. The best I can do. This is as honest I can be. This is what I have come up with.
So would you say that the final feeling of the poem is one of optimism? Or do you think that there's so much qualification? I guess you learned from me, although you're older, somewhat more free. That really and truly, the poem doesn't give us any hope that black-white relations in America are going to improve in the foreseeable future. Which of those, if either, do you think is more appropriate in terms of the ending of this poem and how we see it? Optimism or a kind of resignation, a kind of perhaps even cynicism? I don't think this is ever going to change.
I think that it is more cynicism. The somewhat, as Shalyn was saying, would suggest there's no doubt about what you can do as a white person, but there's doubt for me. It is just not the same. So to me, what he's being is very cynical in the end.
Well, again, Winell, I believe there's a quotation that you can share with us that might illuminate something for our viewers.
There is a quote which he uses, I think, which is fairly relevant for this particular one. He says, "We younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame." That's what he says. And to me, at this point, when he would have put that line in the poem, what he's doing is essentially putting a voice to the fact that they're not as free as they would like to be. That is what I think he's trying to say there.
So in a sense, then, we've come full circle.
Yes.
You remember we started by sharing with you 4 poems written by Langston Hughes about race relations in America. And there was a clear sense in these poems, like I Too Sing America or Refugee in America, that a society that is supposed to embody freedom, to be a world leader in justice and equality and so following, has disappointed a significant minority of its people, because the reality is that unlike a lot of the Caribbean countries where black people are in the majority in Caribbean countries, they are a minority in America. And even today in 2018, many black people still feel that they have not been given a fair deal in America. So reading a number of other poems by Langston Hughes will help you to better appreciate Theme for English B. And you can find lots of information about Hughes on Google. You know, the Encyclopedia of the World in 2018. And the thing about Hughes's poetry is that, unlike that of many other writers, as Benel shared with us from one of his quotations, it's quite accessible. You can read it and you can understand it, make sense of it, and begin to get a deeper, broader picture of his concerns and his perspectives on race relations in America. Thank you.